Thank you, Lorenzo, for this kind invitation, and thank you to the students for being here after a long day. And this is my second evening lecture, and I gave my first lecture 2 years ago, and it was a lecture on books in epidemiology, and I could find many good books, Bernardino Ramazzini, Jeffrey Rose, Jerry Morris, quite a few, even Anton Chekhov, with a beautiful epidemiological book on the island of Sakhalin. But I had problems in finding books written by women. So I started to think about it, and I thought that if I would be invited again for a Tuesday evening lecture, maybe I will work on the subject and I will give a lecture of women in public health. So let's start with an introduction, and the introduction has to start with a historical perspective. And it's very interesting because women are present in medicine and in medical science for a very long time. We all know that the Hippocratic books were written all by males, including the gynecological part. But in the classical times and in the Middle Ages, up to a certain point, and we will see that in a short while, actually women were present as doctors, were recognized and estimated. For instance, Plato, who had mixed feelings about the gender issues, but Plato, for instance, in the 4th book of the Republic, uses women doctor as having the same nature of male doctors to show that the males and females had the same capabilities and the same nature. Or I think a few decades ago, a very interesting funerary marble was found near Athens, and it was dedicated to Phanostrate, midwife and physician, who did no harm to anyone and who after death is mourned by all. So there were women who were called, even when they were dead, on the marble as physician. Or even Galen recorded the activities of several female physicians. One of such women was even a surgeon in the Roman army. Then we have, in the 5th century, Hypatia of Alexandria, which was, of course, as we all know, a philosopher, an astronomer, a mathematician, but also a physician. Recently, there are books and articles which point out that she was also a physician. Just to start, she is credited with the invention of the hydroscope or hydrometer, which was used in the medical and pharmacological practices of the time. So she invented a medical instrument. She was probably practicing as a physician as well. Certainly, she applied the rigor of logic and mathematics and physics to the study of bodies and nature, and that is recorded. And even more important, and we will come back to this later also, the scientific and naturalistic disciplines in that period were deeply intertwined. Medicine was part of the comprehensive philosophical and scientific knowledge practice in her Neoplatonic school. And this continued through the Middle Ages up to a certain point. Now, there is a very interesting experience, which is the Scuola Medica Salernitana, founded in the 9th century and abolished by Gioacchino Murat in the Napoleonic years. That was the first and most important medical school in Europe, and it was famously accepting both women as a student and the professors. And the school was based, it was a very interesting school, she was based on the synthesis of the Greek, Latin tradition supplemented by notions from Arab and Jewish culture. So it was a very comprehensive, culturally speaking, school. And the practice and cultural prevention were very present in the school, rather than cure, opening the way to empirical method in medicine. The most famous exponent of the Salernitan School of Medicine, medical school, was actually a woman, Trota de Ruggero, we know very little about her. We know that she existed more or less in that 11th century. We know that she wrote a book on treatment of women, which was a practical treatise addressing women's health. And we also know that the Trotula Compendium, that for many centuries was attributed to her, was actually a compendium over time where her writings were combined with anonymous texts to form a 3-volume medieval medical guide. She had a holistic approach, advocated for natural health strategies, including cleanliness, balanced diets, and stress avoidance. She discussed birth control, problems of infertility, stating that infertility is a male problem as often as a female one. Just to give you an idea of the importance of her books, when Gutenberg invented printing, actually one of the first books to be printed after the Bible was the Trotula Compendium. Another impressive woman of that, more or less of that century, actually she was born in 1098, was Hildegard von Bingen. She was an abbess, a visionary mystic, a composer, a lyric poet, a doctor of the church, a saint, and in particular a patron saint of musicians and writers. But she was also a writer of treatises in medicine, and these books are still, translated from Latin of course, are still published. There are at least 3 of them which are still on the market that you can buy when you want. And that gives you the importance of these books and of the author. Physica was the discussion of the scientific and medicinal properties of plants, stones, fish, reptiles, animals, and it contains the first recorded reference to the use of hops in beer as a preservative. So tonight when you go to San Domenico, have it toasted with your beer, have it toasted to Saint Hildegard. The second one was Causa et Cura. It was an etiology of diseases, as well as human sexuality, psychology, physiology. And it did emphasize the vital connection between the health of the natural world and the health of the human person. It stresses the value of boiled drinking water in an attempt to prevent prevention. So quite a few modern anticipations are present there. Now, these books are historically significant because they show areas of medieval medicine that are not really documented, as their practitioners, mainly women, rarely wrote in Latin, contrary to Hildegard, who was, of course, a very well-educated and wealthy, high-class woman. So, there is a very interesting hypothesis by Martha Green, an American historian of medicine, and she asked herself, when did medical practice and medical science became dominated by males only? And her answer is that it was the birth of universities which actually birthed women from universities. So it started in Bologna in 1018, and by 2024, most of the oldest universities in Europe had been founded. And what happens at that time? There is really a paradigm which changes in a negative way, because European universities systematically, from the beginning, birthed women from formal medical degrees. And universities did concentrate an impressive cultural and economic power. And wherever you have power and you have money, usually males tend to jump in. And that is what happened in that century. Just to give you an idea, and before that, women were practicing medicine. I mean, it was recognized, Trota of Salerno was a real physician. And it was the most important exponent of the Salernitana school, medical school. And Green gives an example. In 1322, there was a trial in Paris against a woman, Jacqueline Felice, and because she was practicing illegally medicine. How could she practice medicine given that she could not get a degree? And in the same year, there were 6 women doctors practicing in Venice, 10 in Florence, and many others in many Italian cities, but not in Bologna, where you had a university, and where the mayors of the medical school of the university would prohibit women to practice medicine because they had not gotten a degree that they could not, of course, get, because they were barred by the universities. And in 1325, Pope John XXII had received an appeal from the professors of La Sorbonne, the University of Paris, and he wrote to Bishop Saint Stephen of Paris, ordering him to forbid the practice of medicine by women and by midwives in Paris, warning that these women were in fact practicing witchcraft. Nevertheless, in the Middle Ages, women were the primary healthcare providers for the majority of medieval society, because the men coming from the university were practicing medicine with high requests of high amount of money to nobles, to the kings, to the very top of the society. And but the women were really working as midwives, herbalists, surgeons, in the countryside, in the cities, in the poor areas of Europe, well, in most of Europe at that time. So again, medieval medical practices were poorly documented, as their practitioners, who were mainly women, rarely wrote in Latin and left no written historical memory. And actually, in Europe, as we know, it was not until the mid of the 19th century, 175 years ago, that the first university qualified women were doctors were able to practice medicine. So we will jump now to that period of time, 175 years ago. But before doing that, I would like to mention at least one woman in public health. Lady Mary Wortley Montagu was the wife of the ambassador of Britain to Constantinople. And she noticed that the smallpox, so fatal and so general among us in Europe, is here entirely harmless by the invention of engrafting. Engrafting was to take some powder from the skin of a person with smallpox and engraft it into the skin of a person. So in 1718, she had her nearly 5-year-old son inoculated. After her return to London, she promoted the procedure, but encountered a great deal of resistance from the medical establishment that considered it a folk treatment process. Again, a problem of money, a problem of power. But she was a very high-class person. She had important friendships, including the Princess of Wales, and she convinced the Princess of Wales to inoculate her daughters against smallpox. And that started a practice of engrafting in Europe. For instance, Catherine the Great of Russia inoculated her son, Paul, the future Tsar. And of course, in 1796, Edward Jenner developed the safer technique of vaccination using cowpox instead of smallpox. But still, I would like to point out that Lady Mary Wortley Montagu introduction of smallpox inoculation ultimately led to the development of vaccines, including the one of Edward Jenner, and the later eradication of smallpox. Okay, let's go now to the mid of the 19th century, and I will talk briefly of four women scientists or important in public health. The first one is Florence Nightingale, which was born a few kilometers from here in Florence. That's why her name was Florence, just as her sister was called Partenope because she was born in Naples. And in fact, if you go to Santa Croce, you can see her memorial. She was one of the first female statisticians and developed an early passion for mathematics and statistics. In fact, as most of the high-class British families of that period, She was homeschooled by the father, but she insisted and obtained to learn mathematics from a real mathematician. In 1858, she was the first woman to be recognized by the Royal Statistical Society as a fellow of the society. She is, as we know, the founder of modern nursery care. She reformed the very configuration of hospitals and introduced the use of scientific evidence for healthcare interventions. And after traveling and being educated in continental Europe to study nursing and hospital organization, especially in Germany, Nightingale became the superintendent of a women's hospital in London. And at that point, here are some of the books with her handwriting about notes on hospitals. And at that point, in 1954, in the early months of the Crimean War, there was a report in the Times of the terrible conditions for the British Army hospitals at Scutari near Istanbul. And that shocked the public opinion of Britain, and Sidney Herbert, who was Secretary at War, asked Florence Nightingale to take nurses out there and to superintendent improvements. This is at Waterloo Place in center of London, the Florence Nightingale Memorial. But she was important also for another reason. She realized that knowing numbers alone had a limited persuasive power and used her skills in statistical communication to convince the British Parliament of the need to act. And she avoided the dry tables used by most statisticians and devised novel graphs to illustrate the impact of hospitals and nursing practice reform on army mortality. And here there is a beautiful graph, very innovative for her times, where you can actually see in light blue and light pink the avoidable mortality if different nursing and sanitary conditions would have been applied to the wounded and to the soldiers. So, was she an epidemiologist? I don't know, probably not, but I don't think this is the right question. I think the more important, she was really a public health giant. She translated scientific evidence in healthcare interventions, and to my knowledge, that happened in the Middle Ages already, but in this case, we really have a different situation of, I wouldn't say evidence-based medicine, but something which starts to look like that. And she used also novel methods in communicating scientific concepts and data. Now, the second woman I would like to talk is another giant of occupational health. Alice Hamilton was a doctor, and she was born in Fort Wayne, Indiana, and she is regarded as a mother of occupational medicine and industrial toxicology. She wrote very seminal books, including Industrial Toxicology in 1934, which is a book where American students studied for decades. She was educated in a wealthy and powerful family, but she learned that the wealthy have social obligations no less than personal privilege. And in her autobiography, she says, "My mother made us feel that whatever went wrong in our society was a personal concern for her and for us." She was the first woman professor at Harvard, and it is interesting because there are two interesting considerations to make on her coming to Harvard. The first one is that in that period there was no desire for gender inclusion, and she was simply the best that there were in the United States. She had been trained also in Germany, but she was actually the best in occupational health. And the second consideration, it is rather interesting that just before she was recruited at Harvard, there was a joint commission between Massachusetts Institute of Technology and Harvard Medical School. And she was appointed on the basis of a curriculum that included all factors that influenced health, including air, water, food sanitation, poverty, and migration, which is a good example, in my opinion, of the good which can come when the medical profession and the engineers or the hygienists who build sewage tunnels get together and work together. She stated all her life that prevention was better than diagnosis and cure. She was obviously a doctor, and she was very well known in her times for her strong political, economic, and social critique, for a scientific investigation of lead and other industrial toxins. At the same time, she was working as a doctor for free with migrants, and the migrants, of course, in those days were us. I mean, Russians, Italians, Irish, Dutch. And she investigated, she did also a very interesting and important study investigating typhoid fever in the city of Chicago and the cocaine epidemics in children and adolescents in the same city. So she was a scientist, she was certainly a social scientist, she was an important social reformer, she was an activist, she was a strong and direct she had a strong and direct commitment in changing legislation. She had a socialist ideas, she was a strong pacifist. She had an extremely strong critique of the 1919 Versailles Treaty, predicting a few days after the signing of the treaty that it would lead to another war, pointing out the enormous responsibility of the Allies, Italy, UK, France, and USA, in imposing to Germany such a treaty. She had an enormous number of honors and awards from national and international institutions, and she constantly traveled to widespread industrial safety, but also social justice and peace. And she lived a very long life. She was actually born at the end of the, sorry. She was actually born at the end of the Civil War in the United States, and she lived long enough, more than 100 years, in her house in Connecticut, to be involved in the protest against the Vietnam War. The third person I would like to talk about, she's an epidemiologist, and she's a very important epidemiologist, as important as some of the epidemiologists we mentioned in this course. Janet Elizabeth Leigh Clayton was a physician. She worked in bacteriology and in the lab, and then she moved to the Lister Institute of Preventive Medicine. But she's really a very important person in our profession. And just to give you an example, in 1959, Mantel and Ansel published a classic paper on statistical aspects of the analysis of data from retrospective studies of diseases, where they developed the famous Mantel-Haensel test. And the first sentence of the paper was, the present-day controlled retrospective studies of cancer date from the Lane-Clayton paper on breast cancer published in 1926. And they developed the Mantel-Haensel test using her data, adjusting for confounding. She actually had the thought of confounding, but she couldn't call confounding with that word because confounding was cited for the first time by Fisher 9 years later in 1935. But her paper, which is 135 pages long, is really a beautiful paper. And Alfredo Morabia, an historian of medicine, asked himself, was that study the first case control study ever done? Well, we had other studies. Alexander Louis case a series of 77 cases, which had a prospective contrast. The 1854 Whitehead Broad Street cholera outbreak, it had both a prospective and a retrospective contrast, but it was rather fuzzy in terms of methodology. The Johnson investigation of the cholera outbreak in southern London, it had both a prospective and retrospective contrast, but was not based on subjects, but on households, proxy for the exposure. And in 1920, only 6 years before the publication of the case control study on breast cancer, Brother compared 537 cases of epithelioma of the lip and 500 men without epithelioma, but the methodology and the paper was really with some problems. No mention of sources of controls, and even the average age of cases and controls was very different, 57 versus 36, suggesting that there were some problems in the study. Now, let's see how she designed the study. First, it was a multi-center, hospital-based case control study of 508 women with breast cancer and 509 controls. Women without cancer, but having broadly the same conditions of life. And she's very clear in the paper about this, and she devotes a lot of time to explain why this is important. So it was a multicentric study because she had the idea that you couldn't get a sufficient sample size just in one hospital, so she traveled to London and to Glasgow to get 9 hospitals. Possibly the first ever questionnaire to gather data, a very long questionnaire with 50 questions described with the rationale of why the questions were asked, was probably the first questionnaire ever used, at least to Alfredo Morabia's knowledge. And demographic and reproductive histories were collected during in-person interviews. The study provided the first epidemiological evidence that low fertility increases breast cancer, parity, aged marriage, and artificial menopause were associated with breast cancer. Most of the currently recognized risk factors for breast cancer. And this is funny because for decades, first I thought that Elaine Clayton was a man, because J, for me, it was not Janet, but it was something different. And I always thought that Brian McMahon was the first epidemiologist who talked about these issues and found the link. And it was not true. Actually, what he was thought to have found had been found and very well described in methodology by Lane Clayton. But this is not enough. In 1912, she reported the results of what Winkelstein defined the 3 first by Lane Clayton. First, it was a retrospective cohort study of weight gain during the first year of life among 204 infants fed with cow's milk, compared with 300 infants fed with human milk. And this is the first, as a retrospective, well-designed study. Second, she described, discussed, and analyzed her data for the possibility that her findings were due to sampling variation or confounding. Again, not using the word, but describing something that 9 years later Fisher would call confounding. She used the student t-test to evaluate observed differences in weight gain in small subsets of the study population. And as far as is known, this was the first use of the retrospective historical cohort design and the t-test in an epidemiological study. Now, I couldn't finish this lecture without talking about another great physician, very important in public health, even if she didn't really work in public health. She worked in pedagogy, psychology, and as an educator. She is the founder of the Montessori method, a child-centered educational method based on scientific observation, which promotes independence, freedom within limits, and learning through specialized materials by hand. The idea of social reform was constant in all her life. And even in 1886, there is a typing error, I will correct it. She spoke at a medical congress in Turin on the societal responsibilities for juvenile delinquency. Then, from 1897 to 901, she worked in Rome in asylums for children with mental disorders and in research programs at psychiatric clinics with orthophrenic children. She founded, she opened the Scuola Magistrale Ortofrenica for training teachers in education, in educating children with learning difficulties. In 1907, she opened the first Casa dei Bambini, home of the children, in a poor, at that time, a poor area of Rome, San Lorenzo. By 1908, there were already 5 Casa dei Bambini in Italy, 4 in Rome and 1 in Milan. Today, we have 60,000 Montessori schools all over the world with hundreds of thousands of children educated each year with the Montessori method. Notice that in 1921, the first international, the first International Montessori Congress was held in Denmark with the sponsorship, among others, of Sigmund Freud, Jean Piaget, and Rabindranath Tagore. Then in 1933 in Germany and 1936 in Italy, the schools were closed. She had to leave Italy because of her pacifist and anti-fascist statements. And in 1951, just a few months before dying, she gave a seminal lecture at UNESCO for the 3rd anniversary of Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So, I don't have a final slide for this Tuesday evening lecture. Just a few considerations. First, this issue of the birth of the universities, which bear the women out of the academic and economic power, I think is a very interesting hypothesis. It's more than a hypothesis, I think. Martha Green convinced me that that was really a change in the history of mankind. Then, let's remember that we already said it, the scientific and naturalistic disciplines were deeply intervened until the universities were founded. And medicine was part of the comprehensive philosophical and scientific knowledge practiced outside of the academic. And the people who practiced outside of the academic were all women. So we have these two different streets. One, the academic power of the male from universities, treating maybe 1% of the population, and the women, midwives, physicians, even if they could not be called that way, they were actually called the witches, who practiced for the rest of the people in Europe. Another question is, why were giants like Janet Lane Clayton forgotten for so many decades, and even today are not really recognized as precursors of modern epidemiology? I don't know the answer. Maybe it was a matter of gender, maybe it was a matter of being born in Boston, UK instead of Boston, USA, I don't know. And just a final consideration. When we define science or medicine, we should, as epidemiologists, we should always think of biases. Academic bias, patriarchal definitions of what the science is, what the gender is, what the different professions are. But to develop this last point, would take another Tuesday evening lecture. So if I will receive another invitation one day, but I need 10 years to study these topics to prepare it. So I would like to thank Margaret Quinn and David Kribel, who made me discover the work of Alice Hamilton. I didn't know who she was, even if I was an occupational physician. And thank you to you all.